As David mentioned, my name is Emily. I'm with the Forage Center, and I'm so pleased to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Jared Bell. Um, Dr. Bell is a former U.S. diplomat. He is an international program development management leader, author, professor, and currently senior policy advisor for the Alliance for American Leadership. So thank you so much for being here and just sharing your expertise, wisdom, and knowledge with us. We're so grateful to have you. With that, you can go ahead and get started, and I'll be
Thank
here.
you.
Yeah,
Thank you. I believe you all can see my presentation, correct?
that's right. We can see it.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Um, so thank you all for being here and listening to this presentation. As you all know, I think you probably, as the title of the seminar obviously is that the world is in flux, particularly in the peace building and humanitarian fields with the dissolution of USAID and other things like the U.S. Institute of Peace. I wanted to reflect on this. I started thinking about this when I saw this conference advertisement, and I thought this was such a an important topic to discuss is how do we move forward to design peace after foreign aid? Not that necessarily peace and foreign aid, a peace necessarily existed, without foreign aid before, but I think this is something worth discussing. So essentially, the presentation overview, I want to talk about the turning point, this kind of institutional retreat that we're seeing, the entrepreneurial framework, something that I've kind of laid out, building without big donors, the risks and realities, and also I left some time for discussion. So essentially, what I've kind of strewn together here, and I don't think what I'm discussing is anything revolutionary, but one of the things I've noticed and I've seen in my career as a diplomat and as an academic is this huge chasm between those who actually or academics and who write about a lot of these things with post-conflict peace building, and then those of us who work for USAID or U.S. Institute of Peace or work for the EU and or the UN, who design these kind of peace building programs on the ground. Things look very different in reality than they do in academic literature. So I'm hoping that this presentation is actually bring some of these key things together for practitioners who are doing this work and students and others as well. So as I said, clearly we're at a time of institutional retreat. We see a global shift in peace building infrastructure. USAID faced major historic cuts and restructuring. What's left of USAID has been folded into the State Department in some way, shape, or form. This programming was, 83% of USAID NGOs reported operational disruption in 2025. U.S. Institute of Peace has been renamed and restructured, and a lot of programs that were also responsible for designing and creating peacebuilding programs around the world were halted. About 1 billion in peacebuilding commitments suspended or terminated. This is with international donor fatigue, compounds withdrawal from long-term peacebuilding commitments. Geopolitical realignment reduces multilateral consensus on where and how to invest in peace. There's also 40 plus active conflict zones with reduced international presence as we speak currently. So this is, just in a year's time, we've seen this major shift that I certainly hadn't seen or wouldn't have seen coming moving forward. Especially now, especially at a time when, as we know, when things like climate change, which is on the rise, is impacting things like peace, is through, for instance, land disputes are, as we know, are going to be a key factor in a climate change. As temperatures become more arid and land becomes usable, there's going to be conflict over these resources and water possibly. So we're at a very pivotal time to where we need this kind of peace building infrastructure, and now it's kind of missing. Uh-oh, back. So as we know, who was already here, who was already doing this work? We know that this work wasn't just being done by the U.S. government. So, in this presentation, I want to preface that we know that there are so many instances around the globe of localized peace building, whether it be from local NGOs and civil society, long established frontline actors with deep community trust and sustained presence across different conflict cycles. Religious leaders play a huge role and community leaders play a role in tamping down on conflict. Women's led organizations have played a huge and major role. Youth groups, of course, and grassroots networks, so important. Social entrepreneurs and diaspora networks. Bosnia and Herzegovina springs to mind. Obviously, it's the place where I worked, where all these things are kind of present. And also government and local institutions, state actors, local and national levels remain essential partners in legitimizing and sustaining peace. And so I think these are key factors when we talk about entrepreneurship. The framework is already there. There are already several organizations that are doing several bits of these actors that are doing fantastic work all over the world, with and that was with or without U.S. government assistance. So I do want to preface that and give those who are doing the work their flowers, because I think that's important to draw that this work is going to continue, and it has been ongoing. So what is this notion idea that I wanted to call entrepreneurial peace building, right? This kind of term as I think of this notion idea of entrepreneurial peace building as, instead of this peace building processes that are so formalized by international donors, that this is something that's entrepreneurial, where peace builders now have to think about and do everything, right? And and I'm going to explain what that means. Entrepreneurial peace building is a locally led approach that applies adaptive strategy, resource innovation, and iterative learning to design and sustain peace processes without depending on traditional institutional structures or external donor timelines, right? And so this is I think one of the huge differences that what I wanted to draw on is something I saw versus as a practitioner or as a USAID who worked as someone who worked overseas. Things like resource innovation is something that's not necessarily always discussed or talked about in academic circles, but it's so very important. How do we go about drawing and getting local resources, for instance, to invest in projects in our communities? The one part is not charity, does not rely on donor or hierarchical program cycles. That I also, aside of having been a USAID Foreign Service officer or employee, I also was on the implementation side for ABA Roli, where I implemented programs across Central Asia as well. So this notion idea goes beyond some of these programs. Not top down. Often programs that were designed were top down, but these are community owned programs that don't come from abroad, or that that aren't a part of an organization like USAID or the EU's or an organization like the Swedish International Development Agency that have international development programs and the way of peace building that kind of coincide with their country strategies or embassy strategies or foreign policy strategies, right? So this is not about aid replacement, but complements rather than substitute. But the idea is that this notion idea isn't waiting for rescue. It isn't waiting for some international donor to come in and invest in and build these peace programs or peace processes on the ground that need to take place. It's about seeing this as systems thinking, sees peace as an ecosystem relationship and incentives and feedback. Of course, that's something that draws on a variety of literature, for instance, from John Paul Lederach, and so on. So this is I think the big part that I bring from the practitioner world is where I see this is important. Number one, locally driven program design, community ownership from inception, not just consultation. Oftentimes, in the development world, a lot of programs were designed internally by donors, and then with consultation from local organizations. And so I see this as something entirely different, where this is a locally led and designed process. Capacity building. And what I mean by capacity building is that ensuring investing in local leadership as the enduring infrastructure of these aspects. And I'm going to get into that, what I mean by capacity building as I go on. This idea of adaptive learning, being able to process feedback, it continues to adapt and learn. And then strategic monitoring and evaluation, I think is so important for I also teach a course at NYU on monitoring and on designing programs, and in designing monitoring and evaluation programs. And I think these two are particularly very important. But adaptive learning isn't the same as monitoring and evaluation. Adaptive learning is being able to learn from and adapt how we design programs and how we learn from what's happening in the programs. And monitoring and evaluation is simply being able to monitor and also evaluate how programs end up with a certain outcome, and what those outcomes look like. And they're inextricably linked, and they work together well. Let's move on to the next slide. So for pillar one, when I talk about this idea of locally driven program design, so it's designed from the inside out. Peacebuilding programs succeed when they reflect the conflict's local logic, not an imported theory of change. Communities possess tacit knowledge that no consultant can replicate. Right. I mean, I think that's something that's huge, and was always very much valuable part of my work when working for USAID or anything else. Getting that local knowledge and using that local knowledge is extremely important. As I said, but sometimes that local knowledge isn't always translated into actual projects when you're dealing with something like foreign policy, or you're dealing with something like red tape or bureaucracy. For instance, another key part of this work is congressional earmarks. A lot of what we designed also for USAID and is based on money that Congress allocates, or what Congress wants to see on the ground. So this is something that drives these processes differently now. Redefine the problem before proposing solutions. Standard donor frameworks predefine problems and metrics often. Entrepreneurial peace builders begin with participatory problem mapping. Communities name their own barriers to peace. Again, none of this is particularly revolutionary new, obviously, right? Build for context, not for compliance. I think this is a huge part that for many small organizations that were receiving donor funding, a huge part of this is about compliance and reporting finances, reporting indicators. But how do we shift that discussion for compliance that was so much related to international donors to how do we make this about monitoring and evaluation, or being compliant amongst ourselves and our communities, when there's not that external factor that's there to make sure that smaller organizations or some of these projects are actually working. Accountability flows both ways. Programs must be accountable to communities, not just funders, obviously. And I think that's a big notion that often got lost, I think, in international development work, from my perspective. And I think this is something that's very important. Local advisory structures, community feedback mechanisms, and participatory review cycles are non-negotiable. So I think this is particularly important, where oftentimes this notion of accountability was to funders or funders' interest. And now I think with these this money, or this structure largely kind of being absent, we can kind of shift this focus. The pillar 2 was capacity building. And so what I mean by this particularly is that I see 3 levels to this. There's an individual level, and this is where I think skills are necessary and needed. At the individual level, in terms of negotiation and mediation skills, advocacy skills, proposal writing, and local resource navigation, psychosocial resilience and self-care. I think that's particularly important. Leadership and facilitation skills. I think this is important and part of this pillar as well. Individuals having these skills to be able to go, who may not be a part of the large organization or systems level, but empowering individuals to be a part of a process as an overall wider system. One of the programs I managed here when I was in Bosnia was a local capacity building project, and one of the things that we worked on was equipping community leaders and individuals with these type of skills that were so very important. Instead of looking to the international community, well, what skills what do you have in your own country? What do you have in your backyard? what is it that you can use as an individual? Who can you write to? Who can you contact? So I think this is this works to promote the idea of empowerment of individuals in building peace processes, and when they have the skills to be able to challenge larger systems, or maybe they operate outside of an organizational level. So moving on to that, the organizational level, program design and management, financial management and accountability is a huge part of this. Monitoring and evaluation and learning systems that organizations can apply that work locally. Strategic communications and advocacy, I think that connects to a larger, systems view. Partnership development and coalition building. I think this is also a very much an important part of this capacity building, where you're not relying on donors or the connections that you have with donors, but where you're relying on local ecosystems, not just for money, but also for tools for advocacy, designing campaigns, things of that nature, right? And then the systems level is this at a governmental level, interagency coordination mechanisms that are designed for peace building processes. Budgeting and planning, a big part of making the shift away from international donors is that local governments, and I don't mean necessarily municipalities, but governments at the state level or provincial level or at the municipal level, have to design and manage budgets and planning that promote peace, right? Or that include peace building projects and that allocate money for these projects, for communities. Inclusive governance structures is an important part of this, of course. Cross-sector peace building coalitions that include not just government, but include civil society, that include philanthropy structures, that include corporations or businesses as well. Knowledge management and documentation, being able to, again, continue to have that learning and monitor progress on peace building projects is extraordinarily important at a higher systems level. So pillar 3 is the adaptive learning part, and I think a big part of this is the assess. When we're designing peace building projects, being able to map conflict dynamics and stakeholder needs, to assess, to design, to create with community actors, implement, pilot with short feedback cycles, learn, capture what worked and what failed, adapt, revise, pivot, or scale based on evidence, right? So, and this is something that's particularly important, that will be a sustaining structure for any kind of community-based projects or locally based projects. And the idea is just to cement this idea of active learning, so that the notion is that failure is data. If things don't work or there are setbacks, that being able to use that data, and these aren't program deficiencies to hide from donors, but if something's not working, it's not working. How do you have to adapt and being able to learn and move beyond those issues. Conflict sensitivity as a practice, do no harm, and conflict sensitivity are embedded in adaptive learning, not treated as one-time assessments. Short cycles, deep reflection, weekly, monthly review processes replace these large annual evaluations that were once needed by donors, for instance. Communities as co-evaluators. The people most affected by a conflict are the most reliable judges of whether peace programming is working. So I think this is an important part to consider on a local level. Being able to have this adaptive management, this adaptive learning, be rooted. And for the fourth pillar is strategic monitoring and evaluation, which I think, measuring peace in local terms. So the problem with donor M&E, having been on that side, metrics designed for donor accountability, not necessarily for community impact. Short evaluation cycles misalign with longer term peace processes. One of the things that as I was teaching a course over the semester at NYU over the last few weeks, one of the things that I wanted to impart upon my students is that Long-term evaluations of activities, whether it be peace building or any kind of development, it's difficult. And so no matter if it's an $8 million activity or $10 million activity or program or project or whatever you want to call it, the notion idea that measuring the final outcome or long-term impacts can be extraordinarily difficult. Quantitative indicators, mistrust, relationship repair, and narrative change. Communities are objects of evaluation, not necessarily agents of change. Attribution demands distorting programming towards what is measurable. And this kind of entrepreneurial side, reimagined, is participatory indicator design. Communities set 6 metrics that reflect their peace priorities. And that might not look like what we think peace looks like in a Western context or within Western academia or in international development programming. Most significant change is story-based methodology, which captures what numbers cannot. Numbers are great, but oftentimes, capturing the long-term effects is also understanding how people's lives have been actually changed by a project or a program. Real-time data for action, feedback loops informing program adjustments, not just reporting. Outcome harvesting, attributing change to local actors, not external programs. I think that's a huge part of creating this notion idea of aid dependency when local actors then become so dependent on creating programs or creating initiatives that the international donors won't want to see. Some years ago, while I was managing that activity I mentioned here in Bosnia about capacity building, we put together a large conference, and some of our partners said, "Well, maybe we can come up with an idea, a notion that where we align organizations with what international donors want to see." I nixed that idea because obviously I think that's problematic. We shouldn't want to design programs based on what international donors want to see. The reality is that then we're just creating programs that are funded by international donors who have external interests that aren't necessarily interest to what locals may want. So I think I shifted that notion in the conference we had to, well, how can we focus creating local and sustainable change around the notion idea of what we want, and then using our local resources to build upon that, right? Peaceful proxy indicators, intergroup market activity, for instance, being able to look at things like how people shop, where they shop, schools, how do people attend schools, and what type of school attendance, and then mobility patterns. How safe do people feel going in one area or one place compared to another, especially in immediate post-conflict societies. So finally, I think one of the key aspects of this is leveraging local resources. And that's, of course, looking at social capital, looking at trust networks, traditional authority, intercommunity relations, the currency of peace that money cannot buy. Local culture and religion, that's a huge part of that. Understanding how communities play a huge role in ancient practices and things that might not exist in a development framework or in academia. For instance, we know in Rwanda, a huge peace process was the Gacaca courts that dealt with the result of the 1994 genocide. Diaspora remittances and advocacy are a huge part of that. Being able to get that not only just funds, but being able to get the political voice or those who've left and abroad to be able to pour resources back into the country, and that includes brain power as well, for instance, and their knowledge, their expertise. Also building on local philanthropy and financial resources, community foundations, local business networks. These things are so important. Being able to kind of find and locate these type of resources that can be utilized. Being able to capitalize on youth energy and digital reach is extremely part of this, part of building local resources. And that's through social media organizing, digital storytelling, and peer-to-peer networks that bypass traditional gatekeepers. So this is how we also root this notion of leveraging local resources among young people as well. Cross-conflict partnerships, business relationships, shared markets, and intergroup cooperation as both resource and evidence. One of the things that I often hear about a place like Bosnia, for instance, just to give an example, is that um, there's so much division here, but I think, and that's true, but I think we also don't think and look towards something like the idea of economic reconciliation, where there are people who work across many businesses across the country, regardless of ethnicity and regardless of what happened in the war over 30 years ago. So I think these are important things that we want to be able to capitalize on, and we were talking about this idea of local resource mobilization. So this is kind of like this a fictitious case that I came up with, the Republic of Mirova, and so this is kind of like seeing this model or this idea in a fictional case that's kind of based on a few different contexts. Ethnic divisions, political rupture, and aid withdrawal. So Mirova is a fictional composite drawn from post-war Balkan context. Emerged from a decade-long ethnic conflict between communities over land, political representation, and economic exclusion. Schools remained ethnically segregated, markets split along group lines. War-era property disputes went unresolved. When a political crisis triggered sudden donor suspension, the formal peace-building infrastructure collapsed. But women's cooperatives, inter-ethnic trade association, religious councils, and municipal officials had never stopped working. They decided to fill these gaps. And so this is a kind of an idea of how this actually looks, if in practice. So locally driven design, rather than importing a theory of change, mixed working groups in each municipality name their own barriers, unresolved land conflicts, exclusion from market stalls, and schools that had never been desegregated. Dialogue venues were chosen by communities, a shared livestock market in one town, a mosque, a courtyard in another. The agenda reflected what divided them, not what a log frame required, right? So these more formalized processes kind of or are exchanged for these more informal processes that actually bring people together around addressing their particular needs and fostering change beyond just these long bureaucratic documents or the actual the nitty gritties that we use in terms of program design, like log frames, which are important and they're great, but this is envisioning what peace looks like without some of these more complicated processes or peace building processes. Capacity building, cooperative leaders and trained in mediation, advocacy, and local resource navigation. Critically, groups stopped waiting for grants. They mapped rotating savings groups, activated diaspora giving networks, and secured back from local business associations. 4 programs have become fully self-funded within 18 months. The resource connections, not the training certificates, outlasted the crisis, right? So oftentimes in the context of international development, we put so much emphasis on training. But as we're seeing that even with some of the training that we've had globally, a lot of this stuff hasn't been sustainable, as we're seeing by the numbers of those affected by the cessation of USAID programming. Pillar 3, adaptive learning. When a joint market day initiative launched, vendors from one group began pricing goods higher for buyers from the other, a quiet reinscription of wartime divisions. Community leaders didn't wait for a review cycle. Within days, they shifted from shared stalls to joint purchasing cooperatives, removing the pricing friction entirely. The pivot came from a community member, not from some program officer, or not from someone who's looking to just monitor a program. Strategic monitoring and evaluation. Communities traded what mattered to them, whether children from different groups attended the same schools, whether land disputes were being resolved without violence, whether neighbors traded across old front lines. within 18 months, cross-group market activity rose 40%, 2 inter-ethnic land claims resolved, school attendance across ethnic lines increased in all municipalities, families who had not spoken in decades were buying bread from one another, right? So this is obviously isn't a real country, this isn't a real case, but this is to illustrate how these 3 pillars actually look in practice without some formal activity that's been designed by USAID or the EU. It's literally putting this notion idea of these things to make changes in their lives, these processes, giving communities these tools to make the changes that they see fit, and on their timeline, as I mentioned earlier. So I think some of the aspects of some of the risk and constraints are that there are political constraints here, and that local ownership sometimes, as we hear from the U.S. government, is not actually sustainable. So it was, as I just mentioned, as we're seeing now, a lot of that design of a program for sustainability, again and again and again, kind of aren't, right. So that's something that we think about when we're talking about transferring responsibility without resources, protection, or genuine decision-making authority is not sustainable, right? Elite capture, this is another concern. Without external checks, locally designed programs can be captured by local power brokers who replicate them rather than transform conflict dynamics under a peacebuilding label, right? So these things may be subject to elite capture. Capacity gaps. This particular framework assumes that some baseline capacity to build upon in severely devastated communities and entrepreneurial approaches may need at least minimal external support to restore that baseline. Safety of local peace builders. Obviously, I worked in Nicaragua, which is an authoritarian context as well. Those working for peace or maybe trying to challenge certain narratives may run into safety issues. And without that international protection, or without this kind of support, for instance, from a USAID or a U.S. Institute of Peace, these kind of programs, people may be in danger. Legitimacy deficits. Some conflicts require external legitimacy to convene dialogue between parties who do not recognize each other's authority. Purely local processes may lack that convening power. Scaling without losing the soul. So obviously, locally driven models risk losing their community accountability as they scale. Who controls the replication decisions and on whose terms in political questions. So I think one of the key aspects is as these programs continue to grow and scale, how do we keep them rooted and based in communities without losing some of the key aspects of why the programs are necessary to begin with. So this is just another kind of key diagram looking from aid dependency to peace ownership. External actors define the problem, donor timeline, set program cycles. Success often equals funder satisfaction. Capacity built for grant compliance. Exit equals program ends. Local actors implement external designs, right? And with this idea of peace ownership, where community defines the problem, conflict dynamics set program cycles. Success community equals community peace indicators that reflect the actual individual community. Capacity built for self-determination. Exit equals program graduation from the perspective of local persons and local communities. External actors, if present, can support these aspects, but they're not necessarily driving some of these aspects in projects and programs. And so what this means for you, and I think this is an important part, oftentimes as an educator and also as a practitioner, I think, again, one of my critiques of education, I think when talking about international relations or peace building programs, like getting a bachelor's or MA and in conflict resolution, especially oriented to working abroad, is that learning theory is great, but in reality, as practitioners, we're going to be doing something very different And we need to know how to monitor and evaluate programs. We need to know how to streamline budgets and be to make sure that these activities that we're designing are sustainable, and we have the resources and money to continue them long after they end, or that we're building the kind of cross-community cooperation that ensures a project is going to continue. So what does this mean as a practitioner? Uh, Practitioners, you're the infrastructure, not the delivery mechanisms for someone else's design, right? So we can kind of help to support that particular part. Invest in your own capacity as practitioners, mediation, M&E resource mobilization as a career asset, not just as a program requirement. I think these are extraordinarily important. Especially for those who straddle up in academia. Build lateral networks with peers across organizations. Institutional support will be thinner. Peer networks become critical, and I think we've seen that a lot. A lot of this great work is still going on at the local level, and even also from former USAID staff, whether it be in country or foreign service officers or contractors. This stuff is still going, but it's through peer networks that people are still giving their expertise and supporting. Document what you know. Your conflict knowledge, community relationships, and adaptive learning are irreplaceable. For educators, I think it's important to build curriculum that focus on training students to work in this particular environment. Teach resource mobilization, local philanthropy, and financial sustainability, along with program design. I think these things are so important. And I see this as, again, that's one of my key criticisms, I think, of education in the U.S., even at top universities, students aren't being taught the real nitty gritty of being able to actually push for change. Using case studies should include failed programs and funding collapses, not only the best practices as well. That's how we learn. Prepare students for freelance, coalition-based, and community embedded careers alongside traditional international organizations. I think this is extraordinarily important. While we all want to, and I say this for myself, while I wanted to work for organizations like the UN, or we wanted to work for USAID, or the State Department, or other, even maybe government organizations locally. I think it's important to be able to see the value in training students to work in community-based organizations that actually do this work, and it doesn't have to be for the UN or some other international organization, right? That the meat of that work is there and it's necessary. For students, the field you're entering is structurally different from the one your professors trained in, so I think that's an important, I think, for students to gain and glean now. The world as we know it is extraordinarily different from, I would say, even a year ago, and day by day we're kind of seeing that's not going to change. Prioritize field presence and local relationships over credential accumulation alone. I think that's an important part. Um, um, you know, you know, People want to know what kind of relationships that you have and how they can work with you, not necessarily what your pedigree is. Learn to raise, a big part of this is learning to raise money locally. Proposal writing, local resource navigation, and community budgeting are core skills that I think, as a student, I wish I had learned many years ago as an undergraduate. I think the most durable careers in this field will belong to people who are trusted by communities, not just by institutions. So being able to build and keep those community networks that you can rely on and come back to, I think, are extraordinarily important as you go forward in your careers. So the key takeaways here are: institutional retreat is not. We don't need to wait out this crisis. The world is changing, and we have to be able to change with it. I think locally driven design is more legitimate and more adaptive, and often more durable than externally managed programs, especially in this environment. These four pillars: local design, capacity building, adaptive learning, and strategic M&E. These are things that are simply integrated, and they're not just one checklist. I'm sure as we have a more robust discussion, there are certainly things that you can add from your own experiences that you could probably plug into here and add maybe 5 or 6 other different pillars, right? Um, um, it's not about replacing institutions. It's about creating peace infrastructure that does not require them as its foundation, right? The risk of real local ownership you know may maybe met with coded language, maybe elite capture. elite capture of these processes, and also where we actually struggle additionally for to protect those who for safety. Um, um, let's be honest, that peace in this era will be designed from the ground up or not designed at all. So, I wouldn't I wouldn't be looking anytime soon for USAID or U.S. Institute of Peace to come back, or some of these larger institutions that are now kind of retreating. I think this now is the time to focus on peace on the ground and the various contexts that we may work in. Um, and that's it. So these are some questions that I came up for a discussion. I don't think we have time at this point, but I'm willing to. Anyone has any discussions, comments, or ideas or things they want to share? I'm very open to hearing that. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope this was interesting for you all.
Dr. Bell, that was phenomenal. Thank you so much for spending such detailed time speaking about that topic with us. I really just want to reiterate like your last point about peace being designed. Like what a great exploration of what peace can be in the future. And giving us a viewpoint of what peace building and humanitarian aid can look like. Is there any particular just last remaining thoughts or something that you want to just share a little bit of a tidbit of something that we could even start thinking about or doing tomorrow in a very practical way to help this become more of a reality?
No, I think that's an excellent question. I think one of the key ways that what we can start doing tomorrow, I think, is figuring out how we move on, and then figuring out what are your strengths and what are your weaknesses in this particular process. So do you understand the basics of project management? Do you understand the basics of budgeting? Do you understand the basics of monitoring and evaluation? Or do you understand that of adaptive learning? And I know that for some people that these seem more um, um, terms that are associated with international donors, but these are going to be important tools on the ground as well. So I think that's an important. Take stock of your own skills as an individual. Take stock of what you have, and then how do you go about learning to couple what you already know,
Mhm.
and with the skills that you're lacking. I think that's an important part. I think in any field, or I think as a person, period. I like to be able to take time and think about, how do I grow as an individual, and what skills am I missing, and what skills am I lacking. So, for instance, one of the things I did even before I started working for USAID, I took a monitoring and evaluation course that I wanted to learn about monitoring and evaluation, especially community-based monitoring and evaluation.
Mhm.
And I think that's an important part that was very interesting for me. But I think having I did it shortly after I'd earned my PhD, and I think being able to put all those pieces together to understand the theoretical sides of um, you know, listening to Letterrock or Galtung and all these other theories that we draw and listen upon. How does that look like in practice, especially if we're and how do we monitor and evaluate the programs that foster peace and bring people together? So I think that's an important part. Take stock of the skills that you have, and what you may be missing, and how you go about getting those skills that and I would say, like, don't look at this as the skills that necessarily, oh well, this is going to help me get a job. No. Like, as we see, to test, that the job market is very difficult, as we see for
Yeah.
in international development, and these things
But these are
that
still the skills that are required for the work. Like these skills are
exactly
not going away. Like these were
exactly.
required before and they're going to be required in the future still.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
exactly. So
Yeah.
these are the things. These are the skills that are required, and that are going to be used and are necessary. One of the things I think, someone just the presentation before me talked about AI. I think AI is a huge tool that's also going to revolutionize our work. So if you haven't, I'd say get in touch with and understand how you can use. I mean, and there are more discussions that are emerging on this topic. How can you use AI to support peace building processes, and even do some of the work. But again, I wouldn't. As I told my students last week, I wouldn't put all of your all your eggs in the basket of AI to do
Mhm.
your work. You want to be able to do this as your own, and to learn these skills as again, not for the value of someone else paying you to do that, but because you want to do the work to transform the communities that you care about.
Sure. And what a great reassurance that these skills are not going to go to waste, that those skills that we have now are still going to be applicable to a future reality of humanitarian and peace building work. So that's excellent. Thank you so much for